who are we talking about this week? Well, I'm so glad you asked. We are going to look at two women together whose stories interact, Sarah and Hagar. In particular, we're going to kind of zoom in on parts of their stories found in Genesis chapter 16 and Genesis 18, verses 1 through 15. So if you want to go and pull out your Bible, I'll say that again, Genesis 16 and then Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. But there's a lot to discuss. So there are a lot of things that come up with these two women. And in particular, I'm indebted to the work of Wilda Gaffney. I got two of her books sitting right here. Her Womanist Midrash is an absolute must for anybody who is trying to look at the scripture and hear voices that have been left out. Her scholarship is unsurpassed in looking at the actual Hebrew, you really need this book. You need it. Also, she just now has a lectionary as well that I've been really enjoying. So for preachers, you want this book. So some of the themes that she really raises may be uncomfortable. I want to give a trigger warning on this particular conversation. There'll be talk of sexual trafficking, violence, abuse, and especially domestic abuse. And so I just want to lift all that up. So in particular, we'll start with Sarah/Sarai, but we'll interweave some of Hagar's story and how they intersect with one another. Sarah is, of course, the kind of prototype matriarch in this story for all the Abrahamic faiths. So that's Christianity, Islam, Judaism. All of them count Sarah, or Sarai, as she's first named in the story, as the matriarch. She speaks 141 words in the Bible, and I'm also indebted to Lindsay Freeman for her work on Bible women. She really looks at the words that they have and can really help us hear the words of the women in their own voices. I'm going to pause and try to shut my window for this background noise. Hold on one moment. Okay, we're back. Sarai, we first hear about her as Abraham's wife, and she is described, though, in her own right as being somebody who's very, very beautiful, somebody who's also kind of a force to reckon with, somebody who is actually like probably in charge of the household, more so maybe than even Abraham at times. She's a complicated person, though, too, because in many ways, she's a victim of abuse and reminds us that her people will also then hurt people. And you can see this in how she treats Hagar, and we'll say more about that as we go. She's one of the only women in the Bible to be recorded as laughing. Not only one of the women, she's the only woman in the Bible recorded as laughing. She's the first woman of her tribe that will become known as the Israelites, who is buried in the Promised Land. And she's really a spiritual foremother for those of us who are in the Abrahamic faith. Interestingly, she's also the only woman in the Bible to talk about the pleasures of sex, especially past maidenhood. You hear about the pleasures of sex in things like Song of Songs and whatnot, but she really describes it and talks about it in her own life and in her, we might consider it advanced age, probably postmenopausal. And so it's very interesting to think about how the talk of women's pleasure, especially older women's pleasure, just doesn't get lifted up in the biblical tradition, let alone then the later interpretations of the biblical tradition. So I wanted to make sure to mention that. So one of the other things that she sometimes gets defined by, unfortunately, is her childlessness, which is always a delicate topic in whenever you bring into biblical studies. She lived in a time frame where not having a child was considered somehow indicative of being cursed by God, and very, very painful, especially when you think of what God has said to Abraham and Sarah, that that God has promised through virtue of the covenant that God is going to fulfill, that there is going to be a multitude, a nation that comes from Abraham and Sarah that cannot be numbered. But it's hard to imagine how that's going to work when she and Abraham have no children for such a long time. And by a long time, I mean, she doesn't give birth till she's 90 years old. So the miraculous qualities of this are not to be missed. Like, it's supposed to be for us a sign of God's working through this covenant. But sometimes she often gets painted as not trusting God's covenant, because one of the things that she will do in response to this childlessness is to offer Abraham Hagar, her servant, to have sex with Hagar and then produce an heir to carry on the lineage. That could be seen as saying, I don't believe in God's promise, so I'm going to take things into my own hands. But that's probably a modern way of looking at the story, because in Sarah's time, that would have any child born in a household, and the servants are in that household, then that would be Sarah's child, especially if Sarah is the one delivering it, and the story describes that. So some question whether or not it's not a sign that she was actually trusting in the covenant so much that she wanted that covenant fulfilled in a way that would have been legally an option for her, if not one that we think is maybe a good option, but in her time, it would have been an option. There's also a lot of foreshadowing that goes on with Sarah's story. She often, I think, is a good mirror for John the Baptist's birth. So we hear this, that although he's a priest, Zechariah is the priest who is the father of John the Baptist, has not learned from the story of Sarah and Abraham. When Gabriel appears to him and says that his wife will bear a son, who they will name John, Zechariah echoes Sarah's laughter. And now, when does Sarah laugh? She laughs when the three mysterious people come to her tent, her and Abraham's tent, and they not only come in a divine form, but then Abraham waits on them and feeds them, and they are told, they say that Sarah will conceive and have a child, and she laughs at those plans. Fast forward, Isaac, her child, is born, and he is named Laughter. Isaiah is laughter. Isaac is laughter. Sorry. And what's interesting too is that Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth are also very elderly when Elizabeth conceives. So there's a real parallel between John the Baptist's birth and Isaac's birth, a real parallel. Want to also say that that last quote came from Ashley Wilcox in her book, The Women's Lectionary, as well. So lots of good resources here. Okay, so let's go back to some of these themes already that Sarah is talking to us about in her life. Well, part of what we see in Sarah's story is abuse. She and Abraham are brother and sister, so there's an incestuous nature to this relationship. And the Bible, though, does not make a ethical distinction about whether that's good or not, which leads us to, again, remind ourselves when this was written, that perhaps was not seen. It certainly wasn't seen in the same way it is now. Also, there's a decade difference in their age, which Wilda Gaffney will remind us to ask the question, when did this relationship start? It could be when she was painfully young. That's something to think about. Also, there's not one, but two stories in this scriptural account where Sarah's beauty is seen to be so much, even when she's like an older woman, that Abraham is worried that the rich men in the area, including Pharaoh in one of these stories, is going to kill him in order to marry Sarai in this case. And so Abraham is concerned about himself, not Sarah's safety, and he will absolutely let this happen. Twice Sarah is given over to the men, and he kind of is like, well, she's my sister, which isn't a lie. It's just not all the truth. So he pawns her off. It's a form of sex trafficking in certain interpretations, and he also in doing so, like, this is one of the ways that when finally God intervenes in this situation, God is seen as like coming down and putting an end to it. He intervenes on Sarah's behalf. God intervenes on Sarah's behalf and says to the rich men, this is not who you think it is. You have got to stop pursuing her. And in several times, at least in these stories, the timing is unclear, but it seems as though Sarah was at least long enough with Pharaoh to have been given a lot of gifts afterwards. Those gifts are then 1/10 of them given to this mysterious person named Melchizedek, and by Abraham, and like Sarah is not shown as having any input in that. So on top of all of that, this is probably the moment when Hagar enters the scene. Hagar is likely given to Sarah and Abraham, Sarah in particular, because she's noted as being an Egyptian slave girl. And so we know where she comes from. It's the same Pharaoh area. Also, what's interesting about this is it should remind us, some of the same verbiage is used about the fact that Hagar is Egyptian and she's a slave, and then later the Hebrew people will be slaves to the Egyptian. It just reminds us that the wheel of abuse that ends up happening in human situations can go on for generation and generation and generation. Sometimes somebody's on top and they're abusing somebody else, and vice versa, and that wheel needs to be interrupted by God. Then we continue on in this story, and we have Hagar as a part of this story as well. So let's talk a little bit about Hagar. Hagar is, as I mentioned, an Egyptian slave woman, and probably a girl when she's first put into this slavery. And one of the things to note is that her name, names are very important in this story. Sarah will become Sarah, Sarai will become Sarah, Abraham will become Abram, will become Abraham. Hagar is a word that means foreign thing, not even foreign woman, foreign thing. Gaffney writes, I highly doubt that her parents gave her that name. So that is the name that is likely given here by the people that she's in servitude to. And as we said earlier, Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham to produce an heir, which certainly is not a good example of consensual sexual activity. This is an act of abuse for sure. Then on top of all of that, we don't know how long it takes for her to conceive. So we don't know how long this pattern of non-consensual sex with Abraham was going on. When Hagar finds out that she's pregnant, eventually she starts to feel herself being above Sarah, or at least equal to, and Sarah has none of that. Again, Sarah herself has been in this pattern of possible, you might call it abuse, and hurt people will continue to hurt people. So what ends up happening is that Sarah treats her so poorly, abuses her such, that she runs out into the wilderness. And this is where God finds her and makes a covenant with her, not a male, not the head of a household, not a property owner, makes a covenant with her that her son will also multiply and become a great nation. Her son, which is named Ishmael. Ishmael will later go on to be the father of Islam. And so this is why we say the Abrahamic faith really begins here. Eventually, she will be completely banished by Sarah after Isaac is born, when Isaac is about 3 and Ishmael is about 14. And she is just pushed out into the wilderness, where God sees her and gives her a life-giving water. For those of us with a Christian lens, we can hear this life-giving water in the same words that Jesus will talk about later on when he describes himself as the living water. So we also then hear that there's something else amazing about Hagar. She is the only person in scripture who actually names God, not just God naming other people, but she's the one who names God. She names God the God of seeing, as in God has seen me and I have lived to tell the tale. So we have this story of these complicated women who have been thrust into this patriarchy, and we start to have to ask ourselves, like, what do we see arise? We see this blame and shame stuff, right? Abraham at one point says, like, oh, you do what you need with her. It's not my fault that this has happened, right? And we see the shame of this, that Sarah's shame in not being able to have children is such a toxic thing, that the shame gets passed on, and how she ends up trying to stop the shame cycle, right? And this is what ends up happening with shame. It is such a abuse to the soul, that it then ends up trying to perpetuate itself in further abuse. And sometimes it'll turn outward. Some questions that these stories asks of us, I should say. One thing is, what in your life has caused pain like this, that has caused you maybe not to be able to be a sister to somebody else who you've been, or brother to somebody who has been in pain, and how might you start to let that trauma and shame be let out, so that you're able to be present, and vice versa? When has that been on the opposite? When has somebody not been there for you who has every reason to be there for you because they are going through something similar? And are you able to see that with new eyes, and maybe bring that to God to bring some healing to? I also think it's interesting that we see these moments where we can see God, but not actually see God. I mean, Hagar did, but there are these moments where Sarai does not see God for who God is, and she's laughing, right? When she hears God, these mysterious three people, often thought of as the Trinity in Christian tradition, describe her as being able to have children, she laughs, right? Even though she's there with these mysterious beings. How often do we laugh at God's plans? I know there's a saying that says, if you want to make God laugh, tell God your plans, but how often do we laugh at God's plans? And then finally, what do you call God? How do you name God in your soul and in your life? So many titles that have been thrust upon us maybe are sometimes helpful, sometimes not helpful. And what does the God who sees you, what does that intimate form take? And what would you call that God? I think Hagar gives us a good example of how we might do such a thing. So these stories have a lot of tenacity. They also have a lot of human behavior, which is not always pretty. But they do remind us that through it all, God's there in order to be with us. And I think that's an important part in each of these stories that we are reading throughout the women of the Old Testament. So glad you're here with us today. Thank you for being a part of this study, and we'll continue on next week. All right, thanks all. God bless.